Imagine a place where silence weighs more than stone, where the absence of sound becomes a weapon more devastating than any whip or chain. Port Arthur's separate prison, built in 1848 for what equals $10 million today, was designed as the ultimate reform experiment. 50 men, 50 cells, complete isolation for 23 hours a day. The British Empire believed they had created the perfect machine for transforming criminals into model citizens. What they actually built was something far more terrifying, a system so efficient at breaking human minds that prisoners began begging to remain imprisoned rather than face freedom. Men who emerged from those cells didn't commit new crimes because they had forgotten how to want anything at all. This wasn't just another prison. This was humanity's first attempt at mass-producing silence, at weaponizing emptiness itself. The acoustic engineers who designed these walls created something that could erase a man's personality while leaving his body perfectly intact. Today, we're opening the classified medical files, the hidden correspondence, and the buried reports that reveal how the world's most successful prison became its most horrifying failure. We're going inside the stone chambers, where men learned to survive by forgetting how to live. The ruins still stand on the Tasman Peninsula, but the real horror isn't in what remains. It's in what those walls taught us about the limits of human endurance and the terrifying malleability of the human soul. Join me as we examine the forensic evidence of an experiment that succeeded too well and discover why the perfect prison is the most dangerous kind of failure. The edge of the world has a sound. It's not the crash of waves against cliffs, though that never stops. It's not the wind howling across 30 meters of land that separate an island from a peninsula, though that wind carries stories. The sound at the edge of the world is silence, planned silence, engineered silence, the kind of quiet that drives men mad. This is the Tasman Peninsula, Tasmania, 1848. Water surrounds this place on 3 sides. To the north, Storm Bay stretches like a gray mirror. To the east and south, the Southern Ocean pounds against sandstone cliffs that drop 200 feet into foam and kelp. Between the peninsula and the mainland, a strip of land so narrow you could walk across it in 2 minutes, 30 meters, the width of a cricket pitch. The Aboriginal people called this place home for thousands of years. The Penal people knew every rock pool, every safe harbor, every place where the wind dies down enough to sleep without shivering. They had names for the seasons here, words for the way the light changes when storms roll in from Antarctica. They understood something the Europeans would never learn, that this land doesn't forgive carelessness. But the Penal people are gone now. Disease, violence, displacement. By 1848, their voices have been silent for nearly 2 decades. What remains are shell middens buried under imported grass, stone tools scattered in museum drawers in Hobart, and a language that exists now only in the notebooks of the last speakers who died before anyone thought to ask them how to pronounce their own names correctly. The silence here began long before the prison. It began with absence. The first Europeans to stay here weren't interested in names or languages. They came for seals. Hundreds of thousands of fur seals bred on the rocks around this peninsula every summer. Easy money for men who didn't mind the smell of blood and salt, who could swing a club for 12 hours straight, who could butcher 1,000 seals and sleep sound that night. The sealers built rough camps, bark huts, stone hearths. They lived like hermits, like men who had something to escape. Many of them were escaped convicts from the penal colonies on the mainland. Van Diemen's Land, as Tasmania was known then, already had a reputation as a place where the British Empire sent men to disappear. These camps had no law except violence, no authority except whoever could fight hardest when the rum ran out. The sealers kidnapped Aboriginal women, forcing them into slavery and worse. They fought each other over territory, over women, over imagined slights. They died of scurvy, drowning, knife wounds that festered in the salt air. By 1830, the seals were nearly extinct. The camps emptied. What remained were scorched patches of earth, broken bottles, and the knowledge that this place could swallow men whole without anyone on the mainland knowing or caring. The silence deepened. In London, 3,000 miles and 4 months of sailing away, men in wool coats and powdered wigs debated the mathematics of punishment. The year was 1835. Britain's jails overflowed like cesspits. Public hangings drew crowds of thousands, but crime rates refused to drop. Transportation to America had ended with the Revolution. The hulks, decommissioned warships, anchored in British harbors and used as floating prisons, held 12,000 men in conditions that would make a medieval dungeon seem comfortable. Something had to be done. The question was what? Jeremy Bentham, the philosopher, had an answer: the panopticon. A circular prison where a single guard in a central tower could watch every prisoner without the prisoners knowing when they were being observed. The architecture itself would become the discipline. Constant potential surveillance would reform character more efficiently than whips or chains. Bentham's design was never built, but his ideas traveled. Prisons in Pennsylvania had tried something similar: complete isolation. Prisoners lived in cells where they couldn't see or speak to other inmates. They worked alone, ate alone, prayed alone. The theory was elegant. Without the corrupting influence of criminal companions, without the distractions of society, a man would be forced to confront his crimes. Guilt would become his teacher. Solitude would become his salvation. The reports from America were promising. Discipline problems virtually disappeared. No riots, no escapes, no organized resistance. The numbers looked good on paper. What the reports didn't mention was the other numbers: the suicide rates, the incidence of catatonia, the prisoners who forgot how to speak after months of enforced silence, the guards who requested transfers after finding inmates rocking in corners, their lips moving soundlessly, having conversations with walls. But London was 3,000 miles away from Pennsylvania, and good news travels faster than bad news. The Colonial Office, the department responsible for governing Britain's overseas territories, issued new guidelines. Transportation would continue, but it would be rationalized, systematized. The worst offenders, the men who committed crimes even after being transported, would face secondary punishment. They would be sent to places designed not just to hold them, but to remake them. Van Diemen's Land was perfect for this experiment. It was already a dumping ground for Britain's unwanted. The local governor, Sir John Franklin, was eager to modernize the colony's penal system. Franklin was an explorer, a man who understood the power of isolation. He had survived Arctic expeditions where silence and endurance meant the difference between life and death. Franklin toured existing penal stations across Tasmania. Macquarie Harbour on the west coast was notorious for its brutality, but it was also expensive to maintain and prone to escapes. Port Arthur, on the Tasman Peninsula, had potential. It was already operating as a timber station, where convicts cut down the massive eucalyptus trees and split them into planks. The location was ideal, isolated but accessible, surrounded by water but connected to Hobart by a decent road. In 1833, Franklin authorized the expansion of Port Arthur from a timber camp into a comprehensive penal complex. The budget was ambitious, £20,000 in the first year alone. In today's money, that's roughly $2.5 million spent on a prison for 600 men. The money bought expertise. Francis Hartwell, a military engineer who had designed forts across the British Empire, was commissioned to draw up plans. Hartwell had never designed a prison, but he understood fortification. He knew how to build structures that contained, controlled, and intimidated. Hartwell's plans were beautiful in their clarity. The main prison would be built on a rise overlooking the harbor, its walls aligned with sight lines that allowed guards maximum visibility. A church would anchor the complex, because Reformation required spiritual as well as physical discipline. Workshops would provide labor, bootmaking, carpentry, shipbuilding. A hospital would tend to the inevitable injuries. Separate quarters for guards would maintain the necessary distance between watchers and watched. But the masterpiece of Hartwell's design was a building that wouldn't be constructed for another 15 years. A structure he labeled simply as separate prison, 50 cells, individual yards, complete isolation, The building would cost an additional £15,000, another $2 million in today's money. It would house 50 men in conditions more expensive per prisoner than the luxury hotels of London. The stone for Port Arthur came from the peninsula itself. Convicts quarried the honey-colored sandstone from cliffs that faced the sea, cutting blocks that weighed half a ton each. The irony was perfect. Men used their own labor to build the walls that would contain them. The quarrying was dangerous work. The cliffs were unstable, prone to rock falls when winter storms loosened the mortar between layers. Men died cutting stone for their own prison. Their graves, unmarked, dot the peninsula, like periods in a sentence no one wants to finish reading. But the work continued. By 1840, Port Arthur held over 1,000 men. It had become a city of sorts, with its own economy, its own rhythm, its own culture of silence and submission. The convicts worked 6 days a week. They attended mandatory church services twice on Sundays. They ate meals in silence. They slept in dormitories where talking after lights out earned 25 lashes. The system worked, according to the reports sent back to London. Escapes were rare. Violence was contained. The men seemed docile, productive, reformed. What the reports didn't capture was the sound, the absence of sound. Port Arthur had achieved something unprecedented in the history of punishment. It had weaponized quiet. The guards wore soft-soled boots. Conversation was forbidden in most areas of the complex. Even the workshops operated under strict noise discipline. Hammers were wrapped in cloth. Saws were muffled. The creak of leather, the scratch of pencils, the whisper of pages turning. These became loud. The men adapted. They developed a sign language, crude but effective. They learned to communicate through the timing of footsteps, the pattern of coughs. They discovered that sound, when forbidden, becomes precious. A dropped spoon in the mess hall could make 50 heads turn like sunflowers following the sun. But adaptation has limits. By 1845, the medical officers' reports began mentioning incidents. Men who stopped speaking even when spoken to. Prisoners who stood motionless for hours, staring at walls. Cases of what the doctor called melancholia. Depression so deep it resembled death. The solution, according to the latest theories from London, was more isolation, not less. If silence in groups caused problems, then perfect silence in perfect solitude would solve them. The separate prison, Francis Hartwell's masterpiece, was finally approved for construction. Work began in 1846. The building would take 2 years to complete. 2 years of laying stone, installing ironwork, testing acoustics. When it opened in 1848, it would represent the pinnacle of penal science, a machine for erasing criminal minds and replacing them with something better. The first 50 men to enter the separate prison were chosen carefully. Repeat offenders, troublemakers, men who had proven immune to conventional discipline. They walked through the doors under guard, their heads covered with canvas hoods so they couldn't see where they were going or recognize the faces around them. The doors closed behind them with a sound like a book snapping shut. And then, for the first time in their lives, they heard what true silence sounded like. It wasn't peace. It wasn't rest. It was the sound of time moving so slowly, you could feel it in your bones. It was the sound of breathing magnified, until it became thunder. It was the sound of thoughts ricocheting off stone walls, until they shattered into pieces too sharp to think. The experiment had begun. But experiments, by definition, can fail. And when they do, the results are written in more than numbers. They're written in broken minds, in lives that never recover, in buildings that stand empty because no one wants to remember what happened inside them. The men in London who designed the separate prison never heard the sound it made. They never felt the weight of silence pressing down like water. They never woke up in the dark, uncertain whether their eyes were open or closed, uncertain whether they still existed or had simply been erased. They counted success in statistics, recidivism rates, disciplinary incidents, costs per prisoner. They never counted the sound of a man forgetting his own name. They never measured the weight of silence in pounds per square inch. They never calculated the half-life of hope in a room where no light enters and no sound leaves. The separate prison opened on schedule, under budget, and according to plan. For the first time in the history of punishment, silence had been mass-produced. 50 men at a time could now be processed, contained, and reformed through the simple application of nothing at all. The future of criminal justice had arrived. It was quiet as a grave. The first thing you notice about the separate prison is not what you see, but what you don't hear. Your footsteps disappear into stone. Your breathing becomes the loudest sound in the world. When the door closes behind you, it doesn't slam. It settles into its frame with the finality of earth falling on a coffin. 50 cells arranged in a spoke pattern, each one 12 feet by 8 feet by 9 feet high. Do the mathematics: 864 cubic feet of space per human being. Less room than a modern parking space, but measured vertically instead of horizontally, because vertical space feels smaller, more crushing, more like a tomb. The walls are 3 feet thick, honey-colored sandstone blocks cut so precisely that mortar lines are barely visible. Between the stones, a layer of felt. Between the felt, another layer of stone. The acoustics are perfect in their imperfection. Sound doesn't echo in these cells because there's nowhere for it to go. It simply dies, absorbed into stone and felt like blood into sand. Each cell has a bed built into the wall. Not a frame, not a platform, but carved stone covered with a thin mattress that's replaced every 6 months whether it needs it or not. A wash basin, also carved from stone. A wooden stool that doubles as a desk. A Bible. A slate for writing, though writing what is never specified, and to whom such writing might be addressed, is a question that has no answer. The door is oak reinforced with iron, but the iron is wrapped in leather so it won't clang against stone. The lock mechanism is oiled daily to eliminate squeaks. Even the hinges are oversized, designed to move massive weight without sound. Opening and closing these doors requires the deliberate effort of a man who understands that noise, here, is violence. Above each door, a peephole covered with a sliding panel. The guards check each cell every hour, but the prisoners never know when. The sliding panels are lined with felt. They open and close without the whisper of wood against wood. A man can live for months in this place without knowing when he's being watched, without hearing the approach or departure of human authority. Surveillance becomes theoretical, omnipresent, invisible. The corridors between cells are wider than necessary and carpeted with thick runners that muffle footsteps. Gas lamps provide light, but gas lamps are silent. No crackling fires, no hissing oil. Even the light arrives without sound. Guards wear soft-soled boots and communicate through hand signals when within the prison's walls. They learn to move like ghosts, to exist without acoustic evidence. At the center of the spoke, an observation point where a single guard can monitor all 50 cells through a system of angled mirrors. The mirrors are polished daily. The guard's chair is cushioned to prevent creaking. His desk has felt pads under anything that might scrape or tap. Even his paperwork is designed for silence. Soft pencils on paper thick enough to absorb the scratch of graphite. The men who enter this place lose their names on the first day. They become numbers. Separate prison inmates, 1 through 50. Their clothes are exchanged for uniforms of thick wool that doesn't rustle when they move. Their shoes are soft leather, designed for silence rather than durability. They're issued a canvas hood that covers their heads whenever they leave their cells, which happens rarely and only for specific regulated purposes. Exercise occurs in individual yards, each one 10 feet by 20 feet, surrounded by walls 12 feet high. The walls are angled inward so that prisoners can't see the sky directly, only a rectangle of light that changes color as the day progresses. No talking, no singing, no humming. Guards patrol the perimeter of the exercise yards on elevated walkways, watching for any attempt at communication between yards, though such attempts are nearly impossible given the acoustic design of the walls. Chapel services happen twice a week. The men are escorted individually, hooded to wooden stalls that prevent them from seeing each other even when seated side by side. The chaplain delivers his sermon to 50 men who might as well be 50 shadows. They can't see his face. he can't see theirs. The Word of God arrives through felt and stone, filtered through architecture designed to eliminate everything human except the capacity to absorb instruction. Meals are delivered to the cells, porridge in the morning, bread and soup at midday, more porridge in the evening. The food is deliberately bland to avoid the pleasure that might come from taste. Salt is rationed not for health reasons, but because salt makes food memorable, and memory here is discouraged. The guards who deliver meals wear felt slippers and carry keys wrapped in cloth. Even hunger arrives silently. Work, when it exists, is individual and quiet. Picking oakum, unraveling old rope fiber by fiber until your fingertips bleed. Making matchboxes from pre-cut cardboard. Copying biblical passages in careful handwriting that no one will ever read. The work is designed to occupy hands and hours without providing satisfaction or skill. It's labor as erasure, activity as emptiness. Time becomes fluid in the separate prison. Without clocks, without communal schedules, without the acoustic landmarks that normally mark the passage of day into night, hours stretch like warm glass. Some men begin counting heartbeats, others tap their fingers against stone until the guards notice and confiscate their privilege of movement. A few learn to measure time by the color of light in their cell window, tracking the movement of shadows across stone floors with the precision of astronomers. The medical officer visits each cell once a week. Dr. Thomas Anderson, a Scottish physician who signed on for this assignment, believing in the reformative power of solitude. His medical kit contains laudanum for hysteria, mercury for melancholia, and leather restraints for what he terms acute moral insanity. He takes notes in careful handwriting. Patient exhibits signs of withdrawal from social stimuli. Subjects responds poorly to verbal instruction. Individual demonstrates persistent fixation on release date. Dr. Anderson's notebooks, preserved in the Tasmanian State Archives, record the systematic collapse of human personality under the pressure of engineered silence. Week by week, month by month, he documents the transformation of men into something else. Not reformed, not rehabilitated. Something quieter and smaller and more broken than what entered the cells. The first recorded suicide occurs 3 months after opening. Prisoner Separate Prison Number 7, whose real name was William Morrison, though that name appears nowhere in the official records, hangs himself with strips torn from his mattress cover. The death is classified as melancholia leading to self-destruction. The cell is reoccupied within a week. Morrison's personal effects, such as they were, disappear into storage. His name vanishes from all records except Dr. Anderson's private notes, where he's mentioned only as Patient 7 deceased. The guards who work in the separate prison begin showing symptoms after 6 months. Insomnia, hypervigilance, an inability to tolerate sudden noises in their personal lives, several request transfers, 2 resign and leave Tasmania entirely, forfeiting their pensions rather than spend another day in a building designed to erase sound and, through sound, human connection. Captain James O'Hara Boyd, the officer in charge of the separate prison, writes monthly reports to the Colonial Office in London. These reports, meticulous in their bureaucratic optimism, describe the marked improvement in prisoner behavior and the notable absence of disciplinary incidents. What Boyd's reports don't mention is his own transformation. Colleagues note that he's become reluctant to speak in meetings. His handwriting, once bold and confident, becomes smaller and more careful. He begins wearing soft-soled shoes even outside the prison, as if the silence has followed him home. The success of the separate prison, according to the official metrics, is undeniable. No escapes, no violence, no organized resistance. The 50 men inside have achieved perfect compliance with institutional rules. They eat when told to eat, they sleep when told to sleep, they exercise when escorted to exercise yards. They attend chapel services without complaint. They work at their assigned tasks without malingering. But compliance, the administrators begin to realize, is not the same as reformation. Reformed men ask questions about their release dates. They inquire about their families. They demonstrate concern for their futures beyond the prison walls. The men in the separate prison do none of these things. When questioned about their plans after release, they stare blankly, as if the concept of after has become foreign to them. Father Patrick McDermott, the prison chaplain, begins keeping unofficial records of his conversations with the separate prison inmates. His journal, discovered in the basement of St. Mary's Cathedral in Hobart more than a century after his death, provides the only first-hand account of what the men actually said when they were allowed to speak. "They don't confess," McDermott wrote. "Confession requires the belief that someone is listening, that words have weight, that speaking can change something. These men have learned that speaking changes nothing. When I ask about their crimes, they recite the facts like multiplication tables. When I ask about their remorse, they look at me as if I'm speaking a foreign language." One entry, dated October 1849, describes McDermott's encounter with prisoner 23. "He told me that he's forgotten what his wife's voice sounds like. Not her words, he remembers what she said, but the sound of her saying it. He can picture her lips moving, but he can't hear the movement in his mind. It's like watching a play through a window," he said. "You can see the actors, but you don't know what the play is about." The acoustic isolation of the separate prison begins to produce effects that no one had predicted. Men lose the ability to modulate their voices when they're finally allowed to speak. After months of silence, they whisper when they mean to speak normally, or shout when they intend to whisper. Some develop a stutter, not from nervousness, but from forgetting the physical mechanics of converting thoughts into sounds. Others begin talking to themselves, carrying on elaborate conversations with imaginary companions. This behavior, initially discouraged as a violation of the silence rule, eventually becomes so common that the guards stop trying to prevent it. The choice becomes clear: allow men to talk to themselves, or watch them disappear entirely into catatonic withdrawal. Dr. Anderson's medical reports become increasingly clinical as he documents behaviors he lacks the vocabulary to describe. Patient exhibits repetitive vocalizations during periods of permitted speech. Subject demonstrates confusion regarding appropriate volume levels. Individual appears unable to distinguish between internal thought and external speech. In November 1849, prisoner separate prison number 12, George Hartley, a former soldier transported for desertion, begins claiming that he can hear conversations through the walls of his cell. He describes elaborate discussions between his neighboring prisoners, complete with names, personal histories, and detailed plans for escape. When guards investigate, they discover that the cells on either side of Hartley's have been empty for months. Hartley's phantom conversations become more elaborate over time. He reports overhearing debates about politics, reminiscences about life in England, even romantic poetry being recited to imaginary lovers. The conversations, according to Hartley, occur every night between 11 and 3 in the morning. He can describe them in extraordinary detail when questioned, but the acoustic design of the separate prison makes such conversations impossible even if the cells were occupied. Dr. Anderson diagnoses Hartley with auditory phantasms resulting from sensory deprivation. But his treatment options are limited. More isolation obviously won't help. Less isolation violates the fundamental principle of the separate prison. Anderson prescribes laudanum and observation, but the phantom conversations continue, becoming, if anything, more vivid and more detailed. Other prisoners begin reporting similar experiences: voices in the walls, footsteps in empty corridors, the sound of doors opening and closing when no one is moving through the building. The guards, initially skeptical, begin to notice that these reports cluster around certain times of day and certain cells. The acoustic effects of the building, designed to eliminate sound, seem to be creating sound in the minds of men desperate for human contact. By the end of 1849, 18 months after opening, the separate prison has achieved something unprecedented. It has created a form of punishment that operates independently of human supervision. The building itself has become the warden. The architecture dispenses discipline more consistently and more thoroughly than any guard could manage. But the discipline it dispenses is destroying the men it's meant to reform. Captain Boyd's reports to London become shorter and less detailed. Where once he provided statistics on work productivity and disciplinary incidents, he now offers brief summaries. The facility continues to operate according to established protocols. Prisoner compliance remains at acceptable levels. No significant incidents to report. But Boyd's private correspondence, preserved in his family's papers, tells a different story. In a letter to his sister in Ireland, dated December 1849, he writes, "The silence here has a weight to it. You feel it pressing against your chest when you walk through the corridors. The men don't look at you anymore. They look through you, as if you're made of glass. Sometimes I think they're right. Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing too." The winter of 1850 brings unprecedented storms to the Tasman Peninsula. Wind speeds reach 90 miles per hour. Rain falls horizontally, driven by gales that strip leaves from trees and send roof tiles flying like playing cards. The storms damage supply lines, delay mail delivery, and isolate Port Arthur from the outside world for weeks at a time. Inside the separate prison, the storms create acoustic chaos, wind howling through ventilation shafts, rain drumming on slate roofs, the creaking and groaning of timber frameworks stressed beyond their design limits. For the first time in months, the prisoners hear sounds they didn't make themselves. Some stand at their cell windows, faces pressed against iron bars, listening to the storm like music. But when the storms pass, the silence returns heavier than before. The brief taste of natural sound makes its absence more painful. Several prisoners begin demanding to be transferred back to the main prison, even if it means forfeiting any possibility of reduced sentences. They beg for the company of other criminals, for the noise of workshops, for anything that might prove they still exist. The guards refuse these requests. The separate prison was designed as a one-way journey. Men enter, serve their designated terms, and leave only upon release or death. Transfer back to the general population would admit the failure of the system, and the system cannot be allowed to fail. Too much money has been spent. Too many reputations are at stake. Too many theories about crime and punishment hang in the balance. As 1850 progresses, the separate prison begins to produce what Dr. Anderson terms institutional perfectionism. The prisoners become obsessive about following rules that don't officially exist. They arrange their few possessions with military precision. They eat their meals according to rituals they've invented to impose order on time that seems orderless. They exercise in their cells with mathematical regularity, counting repetitions and tracking improvement in activities that serve no purpose beyond filling hours. This perfectionism, Anderson realizes, is not health. It's a symptom of minds trying to create meaning in an environment designed to eliminate meaning. The men are constructing elaborate mental scaffolding to support personalities that the prison is systematically dismantling. The effort required to maintain these internal structures leaves them exhausted, depleted, increasingly fragile. In September 1850, prisoner separate prison number 31, Thomas Wickham, transported for housebreaking, suffers what Anderson describes as complete moral collapse. Wickham stops eating, stops exercising, stops maintaining personal hygiene. When guards enter his cell, they find him sitting motionless on his stone bed, staring at the wall, unresponsive to commands or questions. Wickham can be moved physically. Guards can lift his arms, turn his head, force him to stand, but he provides no voluntary cooperation. He neither resists nor assists. When food is placed before him, he ignores it. When spoken to, he doesn't acknowledge that speech has occurred. He has become, in Anderson's words, a breathing statue. This condition, which Anderson terms living death, begins appearing in other prisoners, men who simply stop participating in their own existence while remaining technically alive. They breathe, their hearts beat, their eyes track light and movement, but they provide no evidence of consciousness or will. They've discovered that the ultimate escape from the separate prison is not physical departure, but psychological disappearance. The Colonial Office in London begins receiving reports that trouble the officials responsible for penal policy. Not reports of riot or escape, which would be easier to address, but reports of something unprecedented. A prison that works too well. A system of punishment so efficient that it eliminates crime by eliminating the criminal mind entirely. Lord Grey, the Colonial Secretary, writes to Governor Denison in Hobart. The reports from Port Arthur suggest remarkable success in prisoner management, but raise questions about the long-term viability of subjects upon release. Please provide detailed assessment of post-release outcomes. Governor Denison's response, dated March 1851, is carefully worded. The separate prison continues to demonstrate the efficacy of isolation as a reformative tool. While some subjects exhibit initial adjustment difficulties upon release, all have maintained exemplary records of legal compliance. What Denison's response doesn't mention is that exemplary records of legal compliance often mean complete withdrawal from society. Released prisoners from the separate prison don't commit new crimes because they don't do anything at all. They find employment in jobs requiring minimal human interaction. Night watchmen, lighthouse keepers, caretakers of empty buildings. They live alone, speak rarely, and seem to have learned that the safest response to any situation is no response at all. By the end of 1851, 3 years after opening, the separate prison has become both the pride and the secret shame of the Tasmanian penal system. It has solved the problem of criminal behavior by solving the problem of behavior itself. The men it releases are not reformed citizens. They're not citizens at all. They're something new, humans who have learned to exist without existing, to breathe without living, to survive without hope. But survival without hope, the administrators are beginning to understand, is not the same as success. It's something else entirely. Something that no one in London or Hobart or anywhere else knows how to name, measure, or fix. The silence in the separate prison continues, deeper and more complete with each passing day. It has become perfect in its imperfection, total in its totality, but perfection, their learning, can be the most dangerous kind of failure, and totality can be the most absolute form of loss. The first escape attempt from Port Arthur in 3 years comes not from the main prison, but from the separate prison, which should be impossible. Men in complete isolation, under constant surveillance, with no tools except wooden spoons and slate pencils, don't engineer escapes, they don't communicate plans, they don't coordinate timing, they don't even remember that escape is a possibility. But in April 1851, prisoner separate prison number 19 disappears. His real name was Martin Cash, though that name exists nowhere in the official records of his isolation. Cash was a bushranger, a highway robber who had terrorized the roads around Hobart before his capture. He had already escaped twice from other prisons. He was exactly the kind of man the separate prison was designed to break. The guards discover his absence during the morning inspection. Cell 19 is empty. The door is locked from the outside. The window bars are intact. The walls show no signs of tunneling. Martin Cash has simply vanished, as if the silence had finally swallowed him completely. The investigation that follows reveals something that chills every administrator who reads the report. Cash didn't break out. He faded out. Over a period of months, he had systematically reduced his presence in his cell until he existed only as a shadow that the guards had stopped noticing. The acoustic perfection of the separate prison, designed to eliminate unauthorized sound, had created an unexpected vulnerability. The guards, trained to move silently, had become deaf to the subtle sounds that indicate human presence. Cash had learned to breathe so quietly that his respiration couldn't be heard through the cell door. He had trained his heartbeat to slow to near hibernation levels. He had taught his body to require less food, less movement, less evidence of life. When the guards checked his cell, they saw what they expected to see: a motionless figure on the stone bed. Cash had arranged his blankets and clothing to create the illusion of a sleeping body. In the dim light of the gas lamps, filtered through the felt-lined peephole, the illusion was perfect. But where had he gone? The lock showed no signs of tampering. The window was 12 feet above ground level and faced a sheer cliff that dropped 200 feet to the sea. The cell door opened onto a corridor under constant surveillance. The answer, when it comes, redefines what the administrators thought they knew about human adaptability under extreme conditions. Cash hadn't escaped through space. He had escaped through time. The guards' inspection rounds followed a rigid schedule. Every hour, on the hour, beginning at 6 in the morning and ending at 10 at night. During night hours, inspections occurred every 2 hours. The timing never varied. Cash had spent 18 months learning to count time without clocks, to measure hours by heartbeat and breath. On the night of his escape, Cash had waited until the 10 o'clock inspection passed. Then he had worked the lock, not by forcing it, but by manipulating the felt padding that lined the mechanism. Months of patient work had loosened the felt enough to allow access to the lock's internal mechanism. Cash possessed something that the designers of the separate prison hadn't accounted for. The skills of a professional criminal combined with months of enforced patience and the desperate focus that comes from having nothing to lose. Once outside his cell, Cash had moved through corridors he had mapped by counting the echoes of footsteps during guard rotations. Sound, forbidden to the prisoners, had become his navigation system. The acoustic dampening that prevented prisoners from communicating had also prevented them from being detected when they moved without permission. Cash reached the outer wall of the separate prison by following air currents, the movement of oxygen through the building's ventilation system. He climbed the wall using handholds he had identified by listening to wind patterns during storms. He escaped over terrain he had never seen by following the sound of water moving toward the sea. He was recaptured 3 days later, nearly dead from exposure, attempting to build a raft from driftwood on a beach 15 miles from Port Arthur. His recapture brought relief to the administrators, but his escape had revealed something more troubling than the temporary loss of one prisoner. The separate prison could create men more dangerous than those who entered it. Cash had developed abilities that no criminal in history had possessed. Superhuman patience, perfect silence, the capacity to exist without evidence. 18 months of sensory deprivation had not reformed him. It had evolved him into something that conventional security could not contain. When Cash was returned to the separate prison, he was placed in a cell modified specifically for him. Additional locks, continuous lighting to eliminate shadows, inspections every 15 minutes instead of every hour, but the damage was done. Cash had proven that the perfect prison was not perfect, and if one man could escape, others might discover the same techniques. The investigation into Cash's escape reveals systemic problems in the separate prison that go beyond security. Dr. Anderson's medical reports, previously optimistic about the reformative effects of isolation, begin documenting cases that don't fit the expected patterns. Men who should have been broken by silence instead seem to be adapting to it in unexpected ways. Some prisoners are developing enhanced sensory abilities. After months without normal human contact, they can detect the emotional states of guards through subtle changes in breathing patterns and footfall rhythms. They know when inspections are coming not by counting time, but by sensing the approach of anxiety, boredom, or fatigue in the men who watch them. Others are creating elaborate internal worlds to replace the external stimulation that isolation has eliminated. These aren't hallucinations, Anderson realizes, but deliberate mental constructions. Men are building detailed imaginary cities in their minds, complete with populations, economies, and histories. They're conducting complex imaginary relationships with fictional companions who provide the social interaction that reality has denied them. The most disturbing cases involve men who seem to be developing multiple personalities, not as a symptom of madness, but as a survival strategy. They're creating internal companions to provide conversation, entertainment, and emotional support. These conversations, Anderson notes, are more sophisticated and more psychologically healthy than many of the interactions between actual people in the outside world. Captain Boyd's monthly reports to London become increasingly cryptic. Where once he provided detailed statistics on prisoner compliance and work productivity, he now offers philosophical observations that trouble his superiors. The subjects of this experiment, he writes in June 1851, appear to be evolving beyond the parameters established for the study. They are adapting to conditions that were designed to be unadaptable. Boyd's private letters home reveal a man struggling to understand what he's witnessed. "We built a machine to break criminals," he writes to his wife. "Instead, we've built a machine that creates something else entirely. I don't know what to call these men when they leave here. They're not reformed. They're not criminals. They're something that never existed before." The summer of 1851-52 brings a heat wave that tests the limits of the separate prison's design. Temperatures inside the stone cells reach levels that would kill men under normal circumstances. But the prisoners don't die. They enter states of semi-consciousness that allow them to survive conditions that should be lethal. They're learning to hibernate like animals, to slow their metabolisms until they require almost no food or water. The guards, working in the same conditions, suffer heat exhaustion and dehydration. Several collapse and require medical treatment. The prisoners, monitored through their cell peepholes, appear to sleep peacefully through temperatures that disable their captors. They've developed the ability to regulate their body temperature through mental discipline alone. Dr. Anderson's medical notes from this period read like science fiction. Subjects demonstrate physiological adaptations previously observed only in extreme environments, he writes. Heart rates dropping to 20 beats per minute during periods of environmental stress, breathing patterns slowing to 2 or 3 breaths per minute, core body temperature remaining stable despite ambient heat exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. These adaptations alarm the administrators for reasons beyond their mere existence. Men who can survive extreme conditions through mental control alone are men who cannot be controlled by conventional means. The threat of physical discomfort, the foundation of all prison discipline, becomes meaningless when applied to prisoners who have learned to transcend physical sensation through force of will. In September 1852, 4 years after the separate prison's opening, the first comprehensive review of the facility is conducted by a commission from London. The commission's chairman, Sir William Molesworth, arrives expecting to find evidence of either remarkable success or obvious failure. What he finds instead is something that doesn't fit the categories that Victorian penology uses to measure prisons. The separate prison has achieved perfect order. No violence. No escapes since Cash's incident. No disciplinary problems. No resistance to authority. The 50 men inside comply with every regulation, attend every mandatory activity, and cause no trouble whatsoever. By every metric that the British penal system uses to evaluate success, the separate prison is the most successful prison ever built. But success, Molesworth realizes, is not the same as effectiveness. The men being released from the separate prison are not returning to normal society. They're creating a shadow society of individuals who exist on the margins of human community, connected to nothing, threatening nothing, contributing nothing. Released prisoners from the separate prison seek employment that requires minimal human contact. They become night watchmen, grave diggers, lighthouse keepers. They live in boarding houses where talking is discouraged. They attend churches where silence is valued. They seem to have learned that the safest way to exist is to barely exist at all. Molesworth's report to Parliament, delivered in March 1853, contains language that would never appear in official government documents before or since. The facility under review, he writes, has succeeded in eliminating criminal behavior by eliminating behavior itself. The subjects of this experiment have been reformed in the sense that they no longer pose a threat to society. However, they no longer participate in society either. They have become ghosts of citizenship, legally present but practically absent. The economic impact of these ghostly citizens becomes clear as more men complete their sentences. Released prisoners from the separate prison don't commit new crimes, but they also don't contribute to economic growth. They don't marry, so they don't produce families. They don't engage in commerce beyond the basic necessities of survival. They don't participate in civic life. They've been trained out of ambition, hope, and desire. Tasmania, already struggling economically, cannot afford a growing population of men who exist without purpose. The colony needs workers, pioneers, citizens who will build communities and expand settlement into the interior. The separate prison is producing the opposite. Men who actively avoid building anything, who resist expansion, who seem to have learned that the safest ambition is no ambition at all. Governor Denison's correspondence with London becomes increasingly urgent throughout 1853. The experiment in separate confinement, he writes, has produced results that exceed the parameters of any known penal theory. While recidivism rates approach zero, post-release social integration is likewise approaching zero. The colony cannot sustain a growing population of individuals who exist outside normal social and economic structures. The solution, when it comes, is bureaucratic rather than humanitarian. The separate prison will continue to operate, but its capacity will be reduced. New admissions will be limited to the most extreme cases. Men already serving sentences will complete their terms, but the facility will not be expanded or replicated. This decision represents an acknowledgement that no one in authority wants to make explicit. The perfect prison is too perfect. Complete success in eliminating criminal behavior has proven to be indistinguishable from complete failure in preserving human nature. But the men inside the separate prison continue their sentences regardless of bureaucratic decisions made in distant offices. They have discovered something that their captors never intended them to learn, that survival is possible under any conditions if you're willing to surrender enough of what makes survival worthwhile. They have adapted to perfect silence by learning to hear the sound of their own thoughts. They have adapted to perfect isolation by becoming comfortable with themselves as sole companions. They have adapted to perfect control by eliminating desire for anything that cannot be controlled. They have become, in other words, perfectly imprisoned, not by walls or bars or guards, but by their own success in learning to want nothing, expect nothing, and hope for nothing beyond the continuation of existence itself. An existence, they have discovered, can continue for a very long time when it asks for nothing more than the right to persist. The question that haunts the administrators, though none will voice it aloud, is whether such existence constitutes life or something else entirely. Whether men who have learned to thrive in perfect deprivation remain men at all, or have become something new, something that human society has no place for and no name for. The silence in the separate prison continues, deeper and more complete, with each passing season. It has become a silence that generates its own sound, the sound of human adaptation pushed beyond the limits of human design, the sound of survival becoming indistinguishable from surrender, the sound of victory that feels exactly like defeat. The newspapers arrive late in Tasmania, 3 months behind the events they describe, but when they finally reach Hobart in the winter of 1854, they carry stories that change everything. The Crimean War has begun. British casualties are mounting. The Empire needs soldiers, not prisoners. More importantly, for Port Arthur, the newspapers carry stories about prisons in other parts of the world. Pennsylvania's Eastern State Penitentiary, the model that inspired the separate prison, is abandoning its isolation system. Too many suicides, the reports say. Too many cases of insanity. Too many men who emerge from solitary confinement unable to function in normal society. In London, Parliament is debating the transportation system entirely. The discovery of gold in Victoria has transformed Australia from a dumping ground into a destination. Free settlers are arriving in thousands, and they don't want to live alongside convict colonies. Transportation, as a system of punishment, is becoming politically and economically untenable. But these distant policy debates don't reach the men in the separate prison. They continue their routines, unaware that the world outside has begun to question the very assumptions that created their imprisonment. They have learned not to think beyond the boundaries of their cells, not to imagine futures that extend past the next meal, the next inspection, the next dawn filtering through iron bars. Dr. Anderson's medical reports from this period reveal men who have achieved something unprecedented in the history of human confinement. They have learned to be content with deprivation, not resigned to it, not enduring it, but actually finding satisfaction in the elimination of choice, variety, and stimulation. Patient exhibits what can only be described as serenity. Anderson writes about prisoner number 7 in September 1854. When questioned about his anticipated release date, he expresses no particular interest. When offered additional privileges, extra food, extended exercise periods, he declines, stating that such additions would disturb his established routine. He appears to have achieved a state of equilibrium with his circumstances that I hesitate to classify as either healthy or unhealthy, as it exists outside the normal parameters of human psychological condition. This contentment troubles Anderson more than the previous cases of depression and withdrawal. Men who suffer in isolation retain their humanity, their connection to normal human desire and emotion. Men who find peace in isolation may have transcended humanity entirely, entering states of consciousness that exist beyond the reach of conventional medicine or ethics. The winter of 1854 brings news that reaches even the separate prison. War with Russia means that Britain needs every able-bodied man who can hold a rifle. Transportation is being reduced across all Australian colonies. Many prisoners are being granted early pardons in exchange for military service. For the first time in 6 years, release dates become meaningful in the separate prison. Men who had learned to think of their sentences as permanent suddenly discover that freedom is not only possible, but imminent. The effect is not what anyone expects. Rather than joy or anticipation, the prospect of release creates panic among many of the long-term inmates. They have adapted so completely to their controlled environment that the thought of returning to a world of choices, responsibilities, and social interaction terrifies them. They petition to remain imprisoned rather than accept pardons. Prisoner number 12, George Hartley, the former soldier who had reported phantom conversations through his cell walls, submits a written request to Governor Denison asking to serve his full sentence rather than accept early release. "I have found peace here," he writes. "I have learned to live without want, without fear, without the complications that made me a criminal. I request permission to remain in this place, where I have discovered who I am meant to be." Hartley's request is denied, but his case represents something that the administrators have never encountered. Prisoners who prefer imprisonment to freedom. Men who have been so successfully reformed that they no longer possess the capacity for crime, but also no longer possess the capacity for citizenship. The release process, when it finally begins, reveals the true scope of what the separate prison has accomplished. The first men to leave after completing their full sentences don't return to their families or seek employment or attempt to rebuild the lives that crime had destroyed. They disappear. Not physically, they can be traced through official records, employment registries, boarding house ledgers, but they disappear socially, culturally, emotionally. They become present absences, men who exist in society without participating in it, who breathe the air of freedom without experiencing its possibilities. Thomas Wickham, who had suffered complete moral collapse during his imprisonment, finds employment as a caretaker of an abandoned church outside Hobart. His duties consist of ensuring that nothing disturbs the silence and emptiness of the building. He lives alone in a cottage on the church grounds, speaks to no one except when absolutely necessary for official business, and seems to have found in his post-prison life the same isolation that defined his imprisonment. When a journalist from the Hobart Mercury attempts to interview Wickham about his experiences in the separate prison, Wickham's response becomes part of Tasmania's folklore. "I cannot tell you what it was like because I was not there. The man who went into that place and the man who came out of it are different people. The man who was there no longer exists, and the man who exists now was never there." Martin Cash, the bushranger who had managed the impossible escape, serves his remaining sentence and accepts early release in 1855. But the man who emerges from the separate prison bears no resemblance to the daring criminal who had terrorized the roads around Hobart. Cash becomes a clerk in a government office, recording statistics about grain imports. He works alone in a windowless room, arrives precisely on time every morning, and leaves precisely on time every evening. He never speaks unless spoken to, and when spoken to, he responds with the minimal words necessary to convey required information. A former associate from his bushranging days encounters Cash on a Hobart street in 1856. "I called his name," the man later tells police. He turned and looked at me, but it was like being looked at by a stranger, not like he didn't recognize me, but like he was looking through me to something else, something farther away. He nodded politely and walked on. It was the politeness of a man who had learned perfect manners and forgotten why manners matter. Dr. Anderson's final report on the separate prison, submitted to the Colonial Office in December 1855, contains conclusions that contradict every assumption about punishment and rehabilitation that had guided British penal policy for decades. The experiment in separate confinement, Anderson writes, has succeeded beyond the wildest expectations of its designers and failed beyond the darkest fears of its critics. We set out to reform criminals through isolation and silence. We have created something that is not criminal and is not reformed. We have created men who exist in a state of perfect compliance with any authority they encounter, perfect indifference to any circumstance they face, and perfect isolation from any human connection they might form. Anderson's report includes a recommendation that shocks his superiors: the immediate closure of the separate prison and the destruction of all records related to its operations. Knowledge of how to create such men, he writes, is knowledge that humanity should not possess. We have learned to manufacture human beings who cannot suffer because they cannot hope, who cannot rebel because they cannot desire, who cannot fail because they cannot try. Such men are not reformed criminals. They are something for which we have no adequate name. But Anderson's recommendation is ignored. The separate prison continues operating, though at reduced capacity, through the final years of transportation. The last convict ship arrives in Tasmania in 1853, but men already sentenced to terms in the separate prison continue serving those sentences until the late 1850s. The final chapter of the separate prison's active history is written not by administrators or doctors, but by the prisoners themselves. In 1857, the remaining inmates submit a collective petition to Governor Young requesting that the facility be maintained as a voluntary retreat for men who no longer feel capable of life in normal society. "We have learned something here," the petition reads, "that cannot be unlearned. We have discovered what life looks like when stripped of everything except existence itself. We cannot return to a world that demands ambition, emotion, and connection when we have learned to live without these things. We request permission to remain in this place, not as prisoners, but as guardians of whatever we have become." The petition is denied, and the separate prison officially closes in December 1857. The remaining inmates are transferred to the general population at Port Arthur, or released outright. The building is sealed, its records filed away, its experiment concluded. But the story of the men who lived through that experiment continues long after the doors are locked. They scatter across Tasmania and the mainland, carrying with them a form of human experience that had never existed before and has never been replicated since. They become night watchmen and lighthouse keepers, grave diggers and hermits, men who find employment only in jobs that value their capacity for silence and their indifference to isolation. Some maintain correspondence with each other, though their letters read more like weather reports than personal communication. "I am well," they write. The work continues. The days pass without incident. They describe their lives with the same matter-of-fact precision they had learned to apply to their imprisonment, as if freedom and confinement are merely different forms of the same underlying condition. By 1860, 3 years after the separate prison's closure, the Tasmanian government begins receiving reports of small communities forming in remote areas of the island. Groups of former inmates purchasing isolated land together, building simple houses, and creating societies based on the principles they had learned in confinement. Minimal communication, individual self-sufficiency, and complete absence of conflict or ambition. These communities prosper in their own quiet way. They produce enough food to sustain themselves. They maintain their buildings and equipment with meticulous care. They cause no problems for local authorities. They pay their taxes, obey all laws, and participate in the minimal civic requirements of citizenship. But they exist entirely separate from the broader society around them, like islands of silence in a world of noise. Local newspapers occasionally publish articles about these separate communities, usually with a tone of bemused curiosity rather than alarm. The former inmates have become a kind of living exhibit, proof of the human capacity to adapt to any circumstance, no matter how extreme. Tourists sometimes visit these communities, expecting to find either tragic ruins of broken men or inspiring examples of redemption and reform. What they find instead defies both expectations. They encounter men who seem perfectly content with lives that would horrify most people, lives devoid of entertainment, romance, ambition, or hope. Men who have learned to find satisfaction in the simple continuation of existence, who measure success not by achievement, but by the absence of failure, who have discovered a form of peace that exists beyond both happiness and suffering. The separate prison is gone, but what it created persists. Not as a triumph of penal science, not as a cautionary tale about the limits of human endurance, but as something stranger and more troubling, proof that human nature is more malleable than anyone had imagined, that men can be reformed so completely that they cease to be recognizably human while remaining perfectly functional citizens. The silence that began in those stone cells continues to echo across the landscape of Tasmania, carried by men who learned to live without sound and discovered they no longer need sound to exist. They have become living monuments to an experiment that succeeded too well. Men who prove that the perfect prison creates not reformed criminals, but reformed humans. Humans reformed beyond the point where reform retains any meaning. And in their continued existence, in their quiet communities and solitary lives, they pose a question that their creators never intended to ask. What is the value of a human being who wants nothing, fears nothing, and hopes for nothing beyond the simple right to persist? The answer, if there is one, lies buried in the stone ruins of the separate prison, where silence has become so complete that it no longer needs walls to contain it.